Good morning. My name is Jason Smith. This is lecture number 3 in the ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2014. I said at the end of lecture number 2 that we were going to jump to the beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution with this lecture, but afterwards I realized that's too much of a jump. We just got done talking about primitive communism, and what we need to do is to trace the development of capitalism first. So that's going to be the subject of today's lecture. Now, I'm going to use the United States as the primary example because most of you, at least at the moment reading this, are going to be North Americans. And the other more important reason is that because the United States is in actuality the ideal country where to examine the development of capitalism. Let's begin with 1781 and General Washington's defeat of the British Army at Yorktown. At that particular, in chapter 22 of your book, it begins, it's called Capitalism Unchained. What exactly do we mean? Well, as I have mentioned before, this British colonial law prohibited the export from England, for example, of machinery to the United States. It prohibited blast furnaces, all of the spinning jenny and subsequent shoot-off materials that were key to the British textile industry. All of that was illegal to export to the colonies, and death penalty was attached to violations of that sort of thing. Now, in 1781, the British are gone. They're defeated, and now in 1782, a man named Oliver Evans, for example, is a good example. What he'd been prevented from doing before was to build what he wanted to build, which was a 100% automated flour factory. Now, he started in 1782. He finished his factory in 1790. It was totally automated and this time run by Watt steam engines, not water wheels. So he licensed that to hundreds of other small capitalists in the newly formed states. And that's just one example of how capitalism was unchained in the United States by the victory at Yorktown in the Revolutionary War. We're going to see real quickly is that there are a whole series of innovations which developed in the United States that Europe may or may not really have been aware of and didn't really matter. If there's one thing that's for sure, that is the North Americans really had little interest in what happened in Europe, except to treat Europe as a market. Now, there were general dislocations in the U.S. economy as a consequence of developments in Europe. For example, Jefferson had to shut down all trade between the U.S. and England and the continent because Napoleon was at war with the British Crown and had both sides had developed protectionist barriers against the other and threatened to sink or capture any American ships that tried to deal with either side, and Jefferson simply forbade trade with those countries. That caused temporary dislocations in the U.S. domestic economy. But it's important to note that the domestic market in the U.S. was so big that it was able to absorb a great deal of the surplus value that was being created here. Now, the first real capitalist depression in the United States that comes across as a consequence of workers being sent to the street as new machinery is being introduced in their factories occurred in 1819. All right, well after the dislocations caused by the Napoleonic Wars, which were not a capitalist depression. Now, so in 1819 we have the first of those depressions existing in the United States, and large numbers of workers were sent to the street. To understand this, think of this fact. There was a tremendous innovation coming now from England as well as from the United States in machine tools, in the production of iron, in the production of machinery. And all of this new machinery is being installed in factories. Small factories that were uncompetitive went out of business. Big factories that were efficient and owned by big capitalists stayed in business but sent their workers, like 90% of them, to the street because the machinery was taking up the slack. What took 100 workers to produce before, say, 1819, now could be done by 10 workers. This is the classical example of a capitalist depression that we talked about in the first 2 lectures. All right, after that, there is a continuing, rapid, dramatic increase of machinery in every aspect of American life. Now, in the days of Oliver Evans, the overwhelming percentage of North Americans were still farmers. They were doing essentially the same thing they had been doing before the Revolutionary War. But as you can see, these little germinals of capitalism were developing quickly now that it was legal for them to do so. And of course they had a huge market. What is more important to a farmer than getting his wheat or whatever milled cheaply into flour? Very little. So Evans was just one of a whole series of pioneers. You have Robert Fulton started putting steam engines onto paddle wheel boats, and it wasn't long before the paddle wheel boats were by the 1820s they were running all over American lakes and rivers. Whether the Europeans knew it or not, there was a tremendous revolution going on inside the U.S. and more importantly, again, let me point out, the Americans didn't care what the Europeans knew. It was just irrelevant to them. They had solved the problem of their feudal overburden in the course of the war, and there was nothing left to restrain them. So capitalism was unchained by Yorktown, and in the 80 years between 1781 and 1861, the U.S. population dramatically increased. In just the last 40 of those years, the U.S. population tripled. One of the reasons was because of the introduction of the mechanical harvester. Of course, it was horse-drawn, but it was producing huge quantities of grains, which were fed into these automated flour mills, and provided a basis upon which the population could expand. And it expanded dramatically from 10 million to 30 million in just 40 years, the last 40 years of that particular period. I want to just mention a couple of things in particular that you could keep in mind. You'll recall the revolutions in Europe of 1848 to 1850 began with the publication of the Communist Manifesto. Not that there was a direct causal relationship, but the January 1848 publication of the Communist Manifesto in London also was the beginning of the 1848 revolutions that started in southern Italy and then swept forward. Now these lasted until 1850, when European reaction was strong enough to suppress these working class revolts, and this resulted in a massive emigration out of Europe, largely to the United States, of all of these radical leaders, one of whom's name was Joseph Wedemeyer, who arrived in New York City in 1850. Now, or 1851. He was 33 years old. He had been a direct participant in the Marxist movement in Europe. He had been on a newspaper there where he was a co-editor along with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So within 4 years of the beginning of the European revolutions, Marxism had officially arrived in New York. The first thing Wedemeyer did was to start another newspaper in English called The Revolution. It was a German-American newspaper. And he lists on his editorial board Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, along with himself and a couple of others. Now, my point here is, contrary to the attitudes that many people, such as myself, grew up with, were propagated in our schools, Marxism was not an alien ideology in the United States. It arrived almost instantly, and it arrived in the form of people who were direct participants with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Wedemeyer went right to work, not only forming a newspaper, but a political club in New York he called the Communist Club, and they were off and running. This is a subject that we'll come back to many different times. Now, in terms of the industrial preparation that was going on before the Civil War, let's just take a look at a few examples. Every aspect of shoe manufacturing by 1860 in the northern states was done by machine in whole or in part, and these machines were run by girls as young as 12 or very young teenage girls. There's a couple of factors you want to take into consideration, but just think about the fact that the industrial preparation for leather goods for the Union Army was in place by the time Lincoln was elected in 1860. It was only a year before, in 1859, that John Brown wanted to get that Civil War started right now and attack the U.S. Army headquarters at Harper's Ferry in what's now West Virginia. As an interesting aside, West Virginia became a state because it was where whites who were against slavery had fled to live and stayed loyal to the Union. But at any rate, all of this was coming. The industrial preparation was taking place. Railroads were booming, especially in the north, and wrought iron manufacture was booming, which meant the blast furnaces were going full blast, and pig iron was being developed into wrought iron, which isn't the best for locomotives, but if that's all you've got, that's what you're going to have to use. And so what happened were the trains got longer and longer, and George Westinghouse eventually invented the air brake so that you could slow those long trains down and make it feasible for them to go. But what really had to happen was to develop, which immediately after the Civil War did develop, mild steel, which you get by being able to blow cold air through a molten iron mass, which brings about a carburization of the oxygen which is inside of that iron ore to a degree that you've changed pig iron into true wrought iron, and if you do it properly, into mild steel. At any rate, all of these technological changes were taking place hand in glove with sociological changes which were taking part in the country. Now this, of course, is the North that we're talking about, but just think about the fact that you have all of these girls and young women working in factories who had in the previous generations been essentially chattel slaves in the home. Now, I don't suppose that they were real thrilled about working 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, but on the other hand, they were doing the same thing before in the home, and they weren't getting paid for it. So these girls weren't being forced into these factories at the point of a gun. Well, you might say they were being forced into the factories by poverty, but this poverty was relative, because when they were on the farm, they always had something to eat and a place to sleep. And while they might have been married to men that would leave a great deal to be desired by modern times, they at least were used to that kind of life. But my point is, this industrialization, as terrible as it seems in terms of exploiting child and female labor, was on the other hand a very liberating effect, and it began to change the social nature of the United States at its very core. There's not anything much more fundamental than changing the life roles of men and women. Alright, so enough said on that particular subject. In Chapter 22, Capitalism Unchained, I go through a whole series of these innovations which were taking place technologically and then also socially. And you'll see that by the time the Civil War breaks out, that is, by the time Lincoln was elected in 1860, the field had to be cleared for a final battle between capitalism and slavery. And it was cleared by that election. In the next 4 years, from 1861 to 1865, almost 4 years exactly, a civil war raged, and of course we know what its outcome was. In Chapter 23, which follows up on this, we started, I call it Capitalism Unfettered, meaning the fetters of slavery were finally removed. So in the period from 1861 to roughly 1878, we have a whole nother jump in the way in which capital is being accumulated. In the period prior to the Civil War, we can think of that as a period of primitive capital accumulation. In the period after the Civil War, we're in a period of massive capital accumulation. Two completely separate things. And if you thought that the capitalism being unchained could never be surpassed, then you have yet to see what happened after the Civil War. For example, just take the iron industry to begin with. The Bessemer process of blowing cold air through a hot iron melt had been perfected. Now, what did this do? Most importantly, it removed the phosphorus in the iron ore deposit in the melt. And that meant that all of the world's iron ores were now disposable or usable by the industry of iron. 5% of the Earth's surface is iron. It's by far the best metal to use for a whole variety of purposes, but before the blast furnace and before the Bessemer process of removing the phosphates, its application had been limited. Now it was completely unlimited. Then you had the introduction of the Martin-Siemens process in the early 1870s, which meant that the hot gases from the blast furnace were being recycled and used to heat the melt on a longer and continuing basis. This dramatically reduced the cost of the fuel that you had to put into the blast furnace to begin with. In the old days, all of the air coming into the blast furnace had to be heated. Now the air had already been superheated, and it was recirculated back to continue heating the melt. That was the Siemens-Martin process. This also allowed longer. You could keep that melt in there for 12 hours, and in the process you could adjust the melt for different kinds of mild steel or true steel ductility for different purposes. Different customers wanted harder steel for this or a different kind of steel for that. Now all of these kinds of specialty demands could be made. And in the railroad industry, which had suffered, as I mentioned before, from the fact that the locomotives were too heavy for pig iron and wrought iron, now you could hot roll and endless quantities of steel rails, and that made it inevitable that the Union Pacific Transcontinental Railroad was going to be only the first of hundreds of similar railroads that were spreading across the U.S. and which became the very foundation for transportation in this country. I've got a combination of handwritten notes in my Kindle here, and I think I might just take a moment to mention to you that this is the first time that I've actually used a Kindle the way we are today, and I've kind of gotten addicted to it. I think you're all going to see that this is, in the long run, going to be far superior to this. At my age, I am still stuck with a little bit of written notes and as well as this, but this is rapidly replacing even the way I prepare for lectures such as this. All right, one other thing I want to mention here, and that is that in the period of primitive accumulation, there was a rapid movement in this country for the standardization of parts and the beginning of assembly line manufacture. Now, it's interesting that this whole idea of interchangeability of parts was first brought back to this country by Thomas Jefferson when he was an ambassador to France for the Articles of Confederation government. And there he met a Frenchman named LeBlanc, who showed him that with modern machine tools you could cut gun parts which were so accurate and do it again and again and again that you essentially you could take any pile of one parts and any pile of the other parts and you could make a gun out of them. Whereas prior to that, all of gun manufacture had to be done by an individual artisan. Well, at any rate, Jefferson came back to the U.S. He convinced the Congress, even long before the French government was willing to do the same thing, to give a contract for $800,000 U.S. to Eli Whitney to build a arms factory based on interchangeability of parts. And they got right down to the work. Whitney had already, as you may recall, achieved a certain amount of fame because of his invention of the cotton gin, which had revolutionized the cotton industry, which had gone from being a kind of household industry into being an industrial production of the necessary raw material for North American and British factories in the textile business. At any rate, these were the kinds of things which were taking place in the United States. And once you had interchangeable parts, you could have an assembly line set up so that a commodity here would get a certain piece put on it there, go to the next part of the bench, get another piece, and so on. You know, of course, we all know that's how Henry Ford started making cars many years later, but that is how it all got started. So it was the Americans, again, who pioneered this, or North Americans, who pioneered this business of interchangeable parts, standardization, which was made possible by this tremendous increase in the precision ability of machine tools to cut iron and steel, and than the assembly line manufacture of such things as guns. The British had been doing this with regard to what they call blocks for naval vessels for quite a long time. So all of these ideas came together in the U.S. where there was nobody to oppose their introduction, no vested feudal interests anymore that didn't want something done for some feudal reason, and the coast was wide open. So the period of primitive capital accumulation features capital being accumulated in this way. Now when we say capital in our terms, we don't mean just money. Money's finance capital, and of course you need that. But in Marxist terms, capital means mostly machinery and factory installation of machinery. So when we talk about the export of capital, in those days what we're really talking about is the export of machinery to cheap labor centers. For the British, that was India, especially after the United States started to go its own particular direction. Now, the next chapter is called Capitalism Unfettered. When we talk about the Civil War, from an economic standpoint, the important thing here is that the entire Southern economy was destroyed. Now, we all, of course, could imagine that from the standpoint of the slaves, they were happy about being freed. But from an economic standpoint, the important thing was, equally important thing, was that all of the restrictions that had been placed on capitalism by the very nature of slavery were gone. For example, if you were a white man in the South and you had to compete with slave labor, you didn't have much left over in the way of money. That meant that you are not a market. You had no disposable income for northern products. All of a sudden, all that was gone. The poverty of the Southern whites was so shocking to northern troops as they entered the southern states that they invented the phrase poor white trash, because they couldn't imagine white people living like that. Well, the reason that white people were living like that is because they'd had to compete with slave labor. Well, now that was gone, and the entire South constituted a market, and that market was developed in various ways, which we don't need to get into for this lecture. But you want to remember that now that all the fetters that had been attached to capitalist development and westward expansion by the mere existence of slavery in the southern states was gone, and it was a time to go whole hog into a new course of action. These particular chapters that we're talking about in the book were written years ago by me, and they haven't had to be changed. All the others have had to be expanded and changed, but these particular chapters on history of capitalism in the United States and the U.S. labor movement have stayed essentially the same. Which brings up a subject that I want to mention real quickly, and that is, when I was writing these, I found that the most important source material was a series of books written 60-odd years ago by a man named Philip Foner. Now, Foner wrote this history of the U.S. labor movement in many volumes. And for those of you who are interested in pursuing the topics we've touched on so far this morning, I definitely recommend that you go to your library and look for them, because most libraries do have all of them by now, all of his volumes. And they have not lost any of their validity, which brings up this other point, and that is most of what you're going to see in the libraries and in your university courses that's called economics textbooks and history books is very bad. Very poor. It's written not to educate but to obfuscate. That's why when you find original sources like Foner, you want to cherish those sources and continue to rely upon them. Be your guide, because you, like most people, including myself, don't have endless amounts of time to read lots of garbage. And even if you did, why would you want to bother with it? So that is one subject in and of itself right there. Let's review for a moment. Chapter 22, Capitalism Unchained, refers to the revolutionary victory at Yorktown in 1781 by George Washington, and we talked about just some of the things which happened to show how capitalism, suddenly now being legal, could expand in the colonies, and how it did in the 80 years between 1781 and 1861. Then we talked about capitalism unfettered, meaning the end of slavery, the very existence of slavery was a system of fetters. And of course in 1865 that was gone. Between 1865 and 1878 that unfettering continued, and there was another explosion in innovation. But the real explosion occurs, and I begin talking about it in chapter 24, Capitalism Unleashed, in 1878. And that period lasts up through 1920. Now, the importance for this lecture series is when you're reading how capitalism developed in the U.S., when there was no longer any kind of chains or fetters attached to its development, you'll get a good idea of the situation that Lenin confronted in Russia in 1917. And that's the whole point of this, to get to this subject of the Bolshevik Revolution. We went through the Bessemer process, the Siemens-Martin process. Let me just give you a couple more examples of how all of this changed. The Bessemer process got the phosphorus out of the iron ore, which meant that all of the world's iron ores were now at the disposal of the iron industry. The Siemens-Thomas process meant you could use far less amounts of fuel in the blast furnaces, and you could control the melt for longer periods of time. The same thing is now going to happen in the oil industry. Now here's the sequence of events. The first true oil well that we would consider an oil well was drilled in 1859 in Titusville, Pennsylvania, by a man who had taken on the title of colonel, but wasn't really a colonel in anybody's army. Had been hired by a New Haven banker to use water well drilling techniques to get oil. That was 1859, the year before the war broke out. Now, what's the real significance of this? Well, it had a real significance during the war, because all of the oil produced in the United States came from just one state, the state of Pennsylvania, where Titusville, where Drake had drilled his first well, is in Pennsylvania. Now, up until that time, in the previous year, for example, 39 million barrels of oil had been dug out of the ground in Europe by peasant farmers who would just get their shovel, go to the spot where they knew they could get it, dig a hole a few feet deep into the ground, get their buckets, fill up a wooden barrel with oil, and then take it to the marketplace where it was sold for a variety of purposes. Okay, that now is going to change. Now these deposits are fairly close to the surface, as you can see. If a guy can just go out in his backyard and dig a hole and get his oil, that's one thing. So these early wells that were drilled by Drake were less than 100 feet deep, and they were drilled by water well techniques. Now what does that mean? Well, in those days, this is well before rotary drilling, in those days a cable drilling outfit was used. Now cable drilling is just kind of an elaboration of using a shovel. You have an iron weight which is pulled up, in this case by a steam engine, then dropped into the ground, and it digs away again and again and again. If you want to see an example of this on film, there's a new movie called There Will Be Blood. You can see a cable drilling operation in practice there in the early part of that movie. Okay, so this adoption of water well drilling techniques by cable drilling to the oil business was revolutionary, because Drake's well started to come in at hundreds of barrels per day. And now, that didn't solve all of the other problems, like putting oil in barrels and then having to get loaded onto wagons, carrying it over bumpy roads and trying to get it someplace. Well, all of these problems would be solved one after the other. But at any rate, the first well was drilled just before the Civil War. And during the course of the Civil War, there was a dramatic shift in lighting. Before the Civil War, most lighting was done by whale oil or turpentine. Now the South had a monopoly on turpentine, and of course, you know, whale oil comes from whalers, and that oil was used for lighting. Now, what changed all of that was in 1856 in Austria, the glass chimneyed lamp was invented. If you've seen a Coleman lantern, you know how they work. exactly the same thing. Okay, that meant that you had gotten all of that kerosene could be used because you would no longer have all of this black smoke issuing out of your illuminating fluid. And so turpentine overnight became irrelevant, as did whale oil, and it was rapidly replaced then by kerosene. Kerosene can be refined, is the easiest thing to refine. You heat up a barrel of oil, and you boil off the lightest fraction, which is kerosene. So right away, oil refining became important. It was, and then the other oil you can use as lubricants for your guns or whatever machinery that you're using. During the course of the Civil War, thousands, not just a few, thousands of new machines were patented and put into play in the northern cities. All of these machines, by the way, were being in factories which were largely run by women and young girls, younger than the age of 12. Okay, so we have the development of the modern oil industry spurred on by the demands of the war itself. Okay, well, at the end of the war, the next big thing that had to be done was to get the oil, find out if there was oil someplace other than Pennsylvania. Now, in those days, pundits were saying, well, it's only a matter of time until Pennsylvania's oil runs out, and that'll be the end of the oil industry. And about that time, oil was discovered around 1878 on the Ohio-Indiana border. But the problem for that oil was it had a high sulfur content. To make it usable, you had to find a way of getting that sulfur out. The way turned out to be adding copper oxide as a catalyst in the process of heating the oil. And that meant that all of a sudden it didn't matter. Oil of high sulfur content was just fine for refining purposes, and that changed the whole nature of the oil industry. First of all, you had oil now in 3 states, and not just in Pennsylvania. And you could use it because chemical engineering, this is one of the first steps of chemical engineering, had made that possible. The same way had it made possible the production of iron without phosphorus by the lining of the blast furnace with dolomite rock, which is magnesium carbonate. So as you heat up that iron melt, magnesium carbonate absorbs the phosphorus, and it meant that all of the world's iron ores were now usable by the industry. These things are happening in tandem with each other, and you can see would have a revolutionary effect on industry, which of course it did. Skipping ahead to the Beaumont discovery, in 1899 you have the drilling by Rotary Drilling in the town of Beaumont, which for those of you familiar with our geography, you know if you drive from Houston to New Orleans, you pass right through the town of Beaumont. Well, 100 years ago, that was the site of the biggest oil discovery in the history of the United States, if not the world, when Beaumont came in at 75,000 barrels per day. The most important thing about Beaumont to the people at the time was the quantity of oil being produced. But the most important thing in terms of the oil industry was that this is the first time that a well was drilled by the rotary method as opposed to the cable drilling method. What does that mean? Well, you've seen movies of drilling rigs, so you know several things. First of all, they have a tower that's 100 feet high sitting next to them, and you can see that the drilling stem itself is turning. Now that's the point. You have a rotary grip at the floor of the drilling rig, which is turning the drill stem. And that rotary grip is being powered by diesel engines. And it has a tricone bit on the bottom of it, which is cutting into the rock on a continuous basis. And each one of these drilling stands is 90 feet tall, made up of 3 30-foot sections. That's why you have the tower to begin with. So you assemble these on the ground, that is, you screw 3 30-foot sections together, lift them with the crane up to the tower, and then you put them in position to be craned over to and dropped on top of the one that's just gone down into the earth. And all of this drilling is being accomplished not by men or by horse-drawn or whatever drawn cables that are dropping sharp iron bits into the ground, but by a tricone bit, which is on the bottom of this thing. Through the drill stem itself, you're pumping water, which lubricates that tricone bit. It's a matter of interest now. That tricone bit was patented and invented and developed by Howard Hughes Sr., the father of the famous Howard Hughes. That made him one of, if not the wealthiest man in the United States, next to John D. Rockefeller. That's where young Howard Hughes got his money to go to Hollywood and make his movies and do the other things that movie, The Aviator, shows you so clearly. At any rate, Howard Hughes Sr. and his partners had drilled this well in Beaumont. Now, that oil that came out of there was high in sulfur content. So to refine it, you would have to use the copper oxide techniques that John D. Rockefeller's men had developed in Ohio and Indiana. But they didn't even have to do that, because the British Navy was happy for several reasons to buy all of their produce. First of all, they didn't care about the sulfur content of the oil. They burned it in their bunkers for producing steam, and it didn't matter to them whether it had high sulfur content or not. That was one reason. The other reason was that the British rulers were concerned about standards competition with them for kerosene in Europe. So by creating for the first time an indigenous competitor to standard that could not be bought out or shut down, they accomplished both a political and an economic objective. And for the Texans, it created a whole new class of wealthy people. If you've seen that movie, some of you that are my age probably saw that movie Giant with Rock Hudson and Elizabeth Taylor, James Dean, and so on. That thing came out in the mid to late 50s. That's where this class of Texas oil men came from. Enough said on that particular subject. But at any rate, between 1878 and 1920, you had a revolution in the production of iron, and now you can make cheap steel with that from just about anything. Same thing with regard to oil. Huge quantities of oil were being discovered. It could all be made usable. If you wanted to clean it up, you could. If you didn't, there were people that would buy it anyway. These are the fundamental sinews which we're going to follow in the course of this series of lectures, as I did in the book. The petroleum industry in itself is the single most important industry to follow whenever you're studying the development of capitalism. Now, the setting for the Bolshevik Revolution is that capitalism was developing in Europe and North America in a way that required the export of great amounts of capital to cheap labor centers in other parts of the world. Now we're dealing with two different things. The Americans have been pretty much locked out of Africa and Asia by the reality of their situation, but on the other hand, that same reality had given them an almost exclusive control over Latin America. So they had their hands full there. To the degree that they wanted to get involved in the old world, they had started the war with Spain over in 1898, sometimes called the Spanish-American-Cuban War. The Cuban part of this was just an excuse to get what they really wanted, which was the Philippines. So the gringos saw that it was easy to defeat Spain, and they went ahead and did it, just boom, 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 and that whole war was over in a very short period of time. Most of you have seen the movies, at least, which feature Teddy Roosevelt's charge up San Juan Hill and that sort of thing, but as I say, the Cuban part of this was just an excuse. The Cubans were about ready to win their war that they'd been fighting for 30 years under Jose Marti, indigenously against the Spanish, and the Spanish were on the verge of defeat. So if the North Americans wanted to get involved in Cuba at all, they had to do it right now. But that wasn't the real reason that they got involved, because frankly, they didn't care that much about Cuba compared to the Philippines. Well, why were the Philippines important? Well, for 500 years, the Philippines had been the European route into China. The Philippines were Spanish property. You defeat Spain, you take all of their overseas possessions, and you all of a sudden have what you have been denied so far by Britain, France, Germany, and Japan, and that is a route into Africa and Asia. So now they've got what they want. Defeating Spain gives them the Philippines, and the Philippines give them one of the oldest and most established routes into China that has ever existed for Europeans. Manila had more billionaires at that time, and that's when $1 billion was a real $1 billion, than any other part of the world. Well, why was that? That was because of the simple fact that this place for 5 centuries had been a center of all of the trade that China conducted with Europe and most of the world. Okay. Now, from the Russian standpoint, and what we're going to get into in great detail in the next lecture, is the Karl Marx. We started out this lecture series by pointing out that the reason he got into the study of primitive society to begin with was because he couldn't understand how the German Social Democrats had suddenly got off on the completely wrong path, had given up all their high-minded altruist socialist ideals to jump on the imperialist bandwagon. So he was hoping that by going back and studying human prehistory through the ethnographic record, that he could figure out how that had happened and thereby get a key on what had happened now, what was happening now. He wrote a paper called Critique of the Gotha Program. That refers to the program that the German Social Democrats had developed at the town of Gotha. He held back the publication of that thing, however, because he was unsure in his own mind what the consequences of it might be and what he would prefer that they did programmatically. It was published after his death, and it makes sense when you see it at that point. The essence of what Marx has to say is that everything the German Social Democrats have proposed in the Gotha program is a betrayal of socialism. Now, this is the situation that Lenin confronted. Lenin was born in 1870, Stalin 1880. So that gives you a rough idea that Lenin was 10 years older than Stalin. And that's kind of important as we talk about the first couple decades of the 20th century, as you'll see in the next lecture. But the key issues of the time were what kind of path should Russian Social Democrats be following? Should they be doing what the German Social Democrats did, that Marx thought was so bad, and Lenin, of course, thought was bad too, when his turn came? How did his turn come? Well, when he was about 15 years old, his older brother was captured by the Tsar's secret police because he had been part of an organization called People's Will, which was anarchist. And what these anarchists had been doing for decades was trying to assassinate czars, and they had been successful in the past, assassinating czars and other government functionaries by blowing them up at one place or another. In this particular case, Lenin's brother had just been part of a People's Will discussion group, but that was enough to get him arrested. And then it was enough to get him executed by the Tsar in a Alcatraz-like fortress that was in the middle of the Lake Ladoga, which is outside of what was then called St. Petersburg, and is again right now, for that matter. St. Petersburg would be renamed Petrograd by Tsar Nicholas when the First World War broke out, and after Lenin's death, it was renamed in 1924 Leningrad, which had stayed until the overthrow of the Soviet government many decades later. But at any rate, what Lenin had to confront was a capitalism gone wild, where not only did you have all of these workers being sent to the street for the reasons that Marx had described and that we've discussed several times, including this morning, where you had millions of workers in Europe that were unemployed. Why? Well, the machinery had been sent to Europe, to cheap labor centers. These guys were no longer needed, but they were more than no longer needed. They weren't just supernumerary. They had been educated by Marxists. They were the enemy within, as far as capital was concerned. They were an arrow pointed straight at their hearts. That what would it be? What would happen if these workers ever got it together and revolted? Well, that their answer to that was to start the First World War. That's one of the two major reasons that the capitalists started the First World War. One was to kill as many million supernumerary European workers as possible, and the second was to take the chance in the role and try to split up each other's properties in Africa and Asia. If you take a look at map of Africa at that time, for example, there isn't any part of it that isn't claimed by one European power or another. Germany, France, England, for example, and they had struggled against each other in there constantly. Now the whole continent was developed, and it's a roll of the dice, luck of the draw kind of deal how that war may turn out. But at any rate, no matter how it turns out, there's no downside, because you have eliminated tens of millions of these dangerous workers back home in Europe. Those are the two reasons for the war breaking out. This was no secret at the time. The Social Democrats, including the Russian Social Democrats, and Lenin among them, all saw this world war coming. What Lenin didn't see was the same thing that Marx hadn't seen hadn't expected from German Social Democrats. What Lenin didn't expect was that the German Social Democrats would violate all of the agreements they had signed in the so-called Second International. We'll talk about the history of that in the next lecture. But that they would violate all those agreements and just invoke the Kaiser of the war funds. Without the German Social Democratic majority in the Reichstag, the Kaiser wouldn't have any money to fight the war. So the German Social Democrats had given him the money to fight the war. And that had gotten things off and running. Now that was a clear betrayal of socialist ideals. The same as Karl Marx had found their Gotha program to be so many decades earlier. So Lenin tried to figure out how that could have happened and how he could have missed it. And to figure that out, he'd had to go to the library in Bern, Switzerland, and he spent a year studying Hegel. But well before that, Lenin had decided that what needed to be done was an armed struggle against the Tsar. And his party, which had become by 1905 the Bolshevik Party. Bolshevik is a Russian word that means majority. The word for minority is Menshevik. And these two words come from a split which occurred in the Russian Social Democratic Party abroad between the two wings, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. Two wings of the Russian Social Democratic Party. Lenin's group was the majority in that split. They got control of the newspaper and the Central Executive Committee of the RSDLP, Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and they adopted the name Bolshevik, meaning they were a majoritist position, which they kept from then on. So by the time of the Russian Revolution of 1917, years later, their party was now the Bolshevik Party, and we've been using that term ever since. The term communist and Bolshevism is pretty much interchangeable, as many of you will know. But the international situation was that capitalism had developed unleashed, unchanged, and not just unchanged and unfettered, but completely unleashed now in North America as well as Europe, and had gone to the extreme final point of forgetting about domestic workers and sending your factories and your machinery into cheap labor centers abroad, which were fairly easily controlled by the British Navy and Army, or in the case of France, by the French Navy and Army, or in the case of Germany, the same thing. So, for example, in China, the German concession at the end of World War II was given to Japan, because Japan had been on the Allied side during the course of the war. So, yes, there was economic reasons in terms of getting a better grip on your colonial sources of markets and cheap labor, but the most important reason from the standpoint of everybody that had to make a decision was all of these restive European workers are a constant threat. Every day when I get up, I got to worry about whether they're going to be out in the streets rioting and trying to take over my property. That's the ultimate nightmare of the European capitalist in the first 2 decades of the 20th century when Lenin was growing up. I think that's going to conclude our Capitalism Unleashed lecture for the moment. And I can just, I think that what I would like you to do, if you have the textbook, is read chapters 22, 23, and 24. And in the next lecture, we're going to talk about the Bolshevik Revolution.